Hello, BookTube. A few months ago, I did a video with 100 nonfiction book recommendations for you. I thought it was high time we did that again. So let's do that again, starting with this book, The Black Rhinos of Namibia by Rick Bass, which is one part travelogue about going to boiling hot Namibia and one part natural history of the enormous animals that live there, the rhinos that live there. Enchanting. Any of you who've read this author already know how good he is on the page. This subject is a little bit out of his usual wheelhouse, but still fantastic. Then we have Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science by Jeff Meldrum. This is unlike other Sasquatch books, most of them, in that Dr. Meldrum is a trained academic and also an expert in kinesthesiology, in the kinesthesiological manifestation of movement in feet, in hands, in joints, on ground, which coincides perfectly with the subject of Sasquatch because although skeptics like to say there's no clear, unambiguous photographic or video evidence, which is entirely true, there is a mountain load of other kinds of evidence. The Sasquatch is famous for tracks, and Dr. Meldrum has been studying those tracks for decades now. And this book is fascinating along those lines. I'm not saying that it will convince you, but it will at least show you that there are serious-minded people who think those tracks could not all have been faked. And if they weren't, if even one of them wasn't faked, well, then it was made by an animal that we don't know anything about, which is pretty interesting. We'll move on to grim reading. This is Dale Van Every, who was a novelist, who turned to writing nonfiction for Disinherited, which is his book about white settlers and their relationship with the indigenous First Nations people who were here when they got here. Van Every knows better than anybody that the silly, noble, savage view of those First Nation peoples is both wrong and insulting. They made incredible amounts of war amongst themselves. They committed incredible amounts of barbarity and atrocities amongst themselves, but nevertheless, when commercial entities and state entities approached these nations and said, let's make binding treaties, the white people who made those treaties never honored them. Never. The treaties were extremely elaborately worded, some of them, and made it clear all the eventualities that might invalidate them. None of those things ever happened. It was just a case of lying in the courts, of just playing for time until, covered wagons of guns could be shipped up in great numbers, until people could be shipped up in great numbers to make the treaties irrelevant. So this is blood-boiling reading, but it is, thanks to Dale Van Every's training as a fiction author, it's gripping, just gripping. I would argue an essential text for Native American studies in America. Then we have a gigantic biography. Of course, there'll be a few biographies on this list. This is J.C. Beaglehole. This is the life of Captain James Cook. A big 1,000-page brick of a thing about the great explorer, Captain Cook. Naturally, his story is a little bit overshadowed by his gruesome end, but Beaglehole is incredibly eloquent all throughout the book. I would argue that in an undertaking like this, it's not a small book at all. You would probably have to be interested not only in the man, but in the time period in order to make your way through this. But if you are, you will love this if you somehow missed it. It's the only caveat I have is that if you're not, I might suggest something shorter and more accessible before you try Mount Everest. Then we have Tacitus Borosi. This is a translation by John Cott of This Way for the Gas, ladies and gentlemen. A thin but immensely powerful book of his on Auschwitz and Dachau. An eye-openingly unsentimental, just bare-knuckled approach to that subject from someone who was actually there. Again, an enormous library of this sort of material, but this stands out. Then we have a literary study. This is by Anne Boyd Ryu. This is Meg Jo Beth Amy, a study of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. Not just a study of what happens in the book. In fact, that's secondary here. To a study of the book itself. What was it? How did it come about? How was it sold? How did it take off in the popular imagination? How did it become beloved? I have never been all that much of a fan of Little Women. I like it just fine, but it's always struck me as a lot more marzipan than solid matter. But I loved this book. This kind of inquiry into a work of literature. You do not in any way need to love the work of literature to love this kind of a book when it's done like this. Proof positive is the next book by Susan Shillinglaw. This is on reading Grapes of Wrath. A tiny little thing from Penguin that was terrific. I am not a big fan of Grapes of Wrath. I think in its own way, it's as maudlin and ham-handed as Little Women, but it doesn't matter. It absolutely doesn't matter. And much like the previous book, this book went a long way towards convincing me to, try it again. Maybe I was wrong. If an author like this can be so impressed by the book, then maybe I'm wrong about it. That's always helpful. That's always very wonderful if a book can do that, even if it doesn't ultimately succeed. If you are a fan of Steinbeck, and especially a fan of The Grapes of Wrath, largely considered to be his masterpiece, this is amazing reading. It was amazing for me. I can just imagine. Then we go back to a few decades ago to an oldie but a goodie. This has received its share of excoriating negative reviews, but it is still wonderful. This is The Dragons of Eden by Carl Sagan, a book of scientific speculations on the nature of human intelligence, on the paths of evolution, on scenes from Earth's biological past. That makes it sound very scattershot and also very dry. This is anything but. It's absolutely wonderful. The author indulges in flights of fancy all throughout this book. They're carefully grounded, they are carefully circumscribed by fact and probability, but they are nevertheless flights of fancy. Not sure how many critics back when this came out were prepared for that or understood what it was trying to do. Ordinarily in a list like this, I would probably recommend The Demon Haunted World before I recommend this, but this has more wonder. So it made the list, and who knows, there will be other lists. And then we have a short biography of King Henry V, he of St. Crispin's Day fame. This is by Desmond Seward. It's called The Scourge of God, and it is actually the best Henry V biography that I've ever read, even though most of the ones that I've read have been 3 times this long. Desmond Seward, when he's on his game, he wrote a couple of books at this period in his creative career that are brilliant. This is absolutely wonderful when it comes to a biography of, believe it or not, elusive king. Then we have Carol Carlson. This is The Devil in the Shape of a Woman. This is a study of witchcraft in colonial New England. Of course, the centerpiece of this will be the Salem witch trials. But, as you can tell from the title, this is about more than that. This is the author digging into what might have been ultimately at the root of this hysteria that swept the whole area. Stressing here for clarification's sake that what was at the root of that hysteria was not actual witchcraft or the actual devil, since those things do not, in fact, exist. But it's instead what undercurrents might have been going on here, especially considering how many of the people who went into fits were young women on the cusp of sexual maturity. I'm not 100% sure that I was convinced by much of what's in here, but it's so grippingly done. And again, it's going at an old subject in a thought-provoking new way. So in the short list of Salem witch trial books that would go on a shelf, it definitely belongs there. Then another piece of well-trod ground. This book sold 1 billion copies. It is, as far as I know, still selling. And if you want to read books on this subject, there are a number of books on this list this time around where if you want to read a book on this subject, you're going to read the book that I recommend, at least, if you read nothing else. This is the same thing. This is Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember, which is his book about the sinking of the Titanic. There were a lot of Titanic survivors who were alive when Lord was assembling the materials for this book, and he goes at it in a very telegraphic, no pun intended, terse, evocative way. Doesn't give you huge amounts of potted history on the White Star Line or anything like that, the way many subsequent very good Titanic histories do. Instead, this is a slim thing. You could fit it in your pocket. And it's memorably good, which is why it sold so well. If you're going to read, again, there will be a little shelf of books on the history of the Titanic. If you're going to read books on that shelf, A Night to Remember and maybe its sequel, The Night Lives On, should be on that shelf. Then we'll go to something much bigger, something far more ambitious. It also, in its way, is extremely readable, but it's a steep kind of readability. You're going to have to square yourself and settle down to work. This is John Reeder's book, Africa, stylized as the biography of a continent. And obviously continents can't have biographies, so you understand the author is trying to plumb deeper depths here, and he does. There's all sorts of culture here, all sorts of especially anthropology. It's not exactly what you would think when you hear a biography of a continent, especially when it's Africa. You would think that it's one story after another of colonial exploitation or tribal kingdoms warring with each other. It's almost consistently not that. It's far more, I don't want to say scattershot, but omnivorously curious. It's a big, omnivorously curious book. A fascinating reading experience. He doesn't slow down for you, and he trusts you to be paying close attention. But if that's okay with you, this is thrilling. Who knows what gems you'll pull from it. I am constantly going back to this thing. And then we have a little thing here. This is a micro study of a bigger subject, and we'll do the bigger subject as well. This is by Hans Zischler, and this is Kafka Goes to the Movies. A little study of one of Kafka's ruling passions, which was the movie theater. He absolutely loved it. In his youth, he had what many a friend referred to as cinematic good looks, and that fact was not lost on him. I'm not saying that he was vain. Pretty sure that in the catalog of authors, Kafka may have the claim of being the least vain, but he was aware of that fact, and was aware also of the magic of the cinema in a life that kind of needed magic, as you can see from his fiction. This is the author going through everything that we know about this little subject. Kafka inspires these kinds of little addendum books. Somebody went through his work life for everything that he wrote in his work capacity, which you could be reliably to assume had no literary quality at all. Somebody still went through it and wrote a book about it. This is far more interesting because here there's no way for this to be quotidian. Kafka was letting his imagination go wild in the movie theater. Didn't think this thing would work, and it does, memorably. And again, Kafka is a huge subject, so I thought I would add another full-throated recommendation for Reinerstock's 3-volume biography of Kafka. This is The Decisive Years, and it's my favorite book in the 3. You recognize them on the shelf. They have a uniform burnt orange color in the American editions. It's not just that it's definitive. It is a 3-volume biography of Kafka that is utterly definitive. It's also that it's thrillingly written. I often bring this point up on this channel that sometimes authors who know they're doing something definitive will not bother to do it well because they figure the definitive part will carry them over the finish line. And unfortunately, it sometimes does. But this is not a case of that. This author is working hard to entertain you the whole time. All 3 volumes. Amazing. But this, I had to mention, I didn't want to mention just fill the whole list with Kafka, so I mentioned just one. Then sticking with biography, we'll go to Claude-Anne Lopez. This is an extremely companionable book about a figure we think we know well, but who manages to evade biographers. This is the Private Franklin. And this is the author digging into what this man was like. The obvious route in there will be from family members. And that is, if you know anything about Franklin's family, that is a very checkered road. For every distant relation that he saved from poverty or helped or elevated in the world, there were closer relations that he hated. Salted earth hatred. This is that, but it's also what was Franklin like when he was out calling with his card and his cane and his hat and whatnot. It's a different kind of Dr. Franklin than you get in any of the other biographies of him. No idea if this is still in print. I'm not worrying too much with this list about what's in print and what's not. But this is an illuminating look at Franklin, no matter how many biographies of him you've read. Then we'll go to a classic, quite literally this time. This is Tacitus, the Roman historian Tacitus. This is the Annals of Imperial Rome. His blow-by-blow, election-by-election, personality-by-personality history of the height of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in ancient Rome. The Julio-Claudians, of course, Tiberius and Caligula and Nero and whatnot, they dominate the narrative, but they aren't It isn't theirs to the exclusion of everyone else. There's plenty of other people in here. And on top of all of that, overlaid on all of that, is Tacitus's razor-sharp irony, his razor-sharp writerly presence. There are plenty of historians in the present day and also in the classical world, all throughout history, who, again, think all they really need to do is assemble their sources and show up. And Tacitus is not one of those. He is bitingly aware of what he's doing, bitingly aware of the ironies and the weaknesses and the flaws and the stupidities of what he's recording. He makes for extremely, I hesitate to use the word, it's a very loaded word, but he makes for extremely contemporary reading. So I thought I'd put him on this list as a classic. Then we have Elizabeth Shannon. This is I Am of Ireland. This was written during the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and she interviews women who dealt with that on a daily basis, who lost sons or brothers or fathers to the violence, or ideologically lost them personally to the manias of the subject matter, and still had to persevere, still had to keep the electric bill paid, still had to keep food on the table. Their voices come out here amazingly. The author makes the very wise decision to let those voices dominate the book. And those voices are not all doom and gloom. There are very odd, puckish eruptions of humor all throughout this thing. And also, graveyard humor as well. This is a marvelous snapshot of, again, a forbiddingly complex subject. Then, talking about forbiddingly complex, we'll move on to a favorite of mine. This is Gay Daily. This is Pre-Raphaelites in Love. This is the whole extended group of the Pre-Raphaelites, but this is, as you can tell from the title, a personal study rather than an artistic one. They were forever enraptured with each other, in odd combinations with life, with total strangers. Gay Daily correctly diagnoses Eros as the motivating fuel of the whole movement, which is both a little pathetic and also incredibly interesting. It's incredibly interesting to watch her go at it from this angle. This remains my favorite book on the Pre-Raphaelites. If you can find a copy, it's well worth the time. Then another biography. This is a very unconventional biography. I've recommended it a few times before. This is Sebastian de Gracia. This is Machiavelli in Love, his study of the author of The Prince. Machiavelli led a colorful life. The Prince is one of the most misunderstood books in all of Western literature. And de Gracia decides here to write a very unconventional book about the man. It's impressionistic. It takes place in long, sustained flashes. It's not at all the stately, authorized life procession of birth, adolescence, career, death. Not at all that. And there are huge helpings of analyses of Machiavelli's work. So, again, as with the Cook biography, I'm not sure that this would do as a first Machiavelli biography. I think you would probably need to know a little bit about this figure and maybe have read, certainly at least, The Prince and the Discourses, but other things too, maybe. But if you do know a little bit about Machiavelli, this is going to strike you as a bolt from the blue. It's like nothing else on this author that's ever been written. Let's see here. Next is Diane Ackerman, who is adorable, but can be a little woo-woo. All of her books are infused with a little bit of woo-woo. And sometimes, let's be honest, a little bit of woo-woo is what you want in a reading experience. This is perhaps the wooiest of her woo-woo books, while they were still under any kind of editorial control. This is The Moon by Whale Light, where it's not a complete tapestry of a narrative. Instead, it's episodic. She will go look at bats or whales or crocodiles and give you a really lovely, beautifully written, evocative, long chapter about them, ruminations on them, meditations on them, large chunks of their natural history. It's an enchanting book. It was very much written to be, which would ordinarily put me off it, but it's an enchanting book. Then we have, to stick with the subject, one of her subjects for just a bit, this is Merlin Tuttle, who is a dean of bat studies, a dean of the study of Microchiroptera, of little echolocating bats. And this is his book, The Secret Lives of Bats, which is just enchanting. It's full of bat lore and bat habitats and bat stories and bat natural history. But also, the author is winningly present throughout as learning his trade adventures with guano and in stinky caves and whatnot. It's the perfect combination of those two things, and therefore, again, if you were making a shelf of essential books on bats, I would put this on there, along probably with his more scholarly treatments of the subject. Then, to stick with natural history, we have Jeffrey Schwartz. This is The Red Ape, his book on orangutans. A large narrative thread running through this book is the orangutan connection, evolutionarily speaking, with humans, which is extremely evident when you watch orangutans, when you watch film of them. It's extremely evident that there's something going on there, because they are not genetically speaking, but rather just in terms of their visual affect, their physical presentation, they are the most human of the great apes. And this book leans heavily on that, to the contravention of some subsequent science, I believe, but still enchantingly so. And again, like with a lot of other books that we talked about so far, and will talk about so far on this list, there's a lot of natural history here. There's a lot of stuff in these pages that is both enchantingly written and will be new to you about what orangutans are like. It would go to an oldie but a goodie. We'll go back to the classical world. This is E.A. Thompson's book, Romans and Barbarians. This is a later edition. This has had many editions. Was for a long time the kind of linchpin study of Rome's interactions with the various. Now I suppose it would be unfashionable to call them barbarians, since they had civilizations and arts of their own, but non-Romans. The Romans certainly thought of them as barbarians, especially if they were rude enough to take up arms against the people showing up by the legion load to take over their land. Thompson does a wonderful job. Slightly dry, slightly on the dry side. It's a slightly academic performance, but on the subject of Rome's permeable border with all of its enemies, all of its many enemies, on that subject, this is a fundamental work of modern research. You have to read it if you're interested in that subject. Then we have Thomas Constam, Constam. This is Do Travel Writers Go to Hell? This is about. It is full of travel writer type stories, Video Night in Kathmandu, that sort of thing. But it's also about travel writing. It's about the whole industry of travel writing and what it's like to be a professional liar. The author leans rather heavily on the fact that many professional travel writers, whether they're doing it for the magazine market, which isn't as prolific as it once was but still exists, or whether they're working these things up into books, that many travel writers are, let's just say, rather fond of tall tales. So there's this wry sense of humor running throughout this thing that will especially appeal to you if you like reading travel fiction, or I almost said fiction, travel writing. If you like reading that kind of thing, you can't miss this book. Then we have another study of an artistic work, but this is a TV show. And this kind of a study of a TV show is rare. They don't happen, and with anything like the proliferation that they should. And that's not just a question of, can you secure an audience? Can you be sure that anybody watched the show? It's also a function of NDAs, of non-disclosure agreements, that nowadays are passed out like hors d'oeuvres on the set of virtually any performance, so that you can't write a book like this. This is by Jennifer Armstrong, and it's called Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted. And it's a behind-the-scenes look, but very much not a tell-all, of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Wonderfully done. Wonderfully intelligently done. It's none of the author has no axe to grind against any of these actors or any of the other actors who are involved, and no axe to grind against the producers or the writers. This is much closer to an enthusiastically appreciative study of Mary Tyler Moore, of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and what made it work, what made it magic. For those of you who were born in the 21st century, you will not remember this show. I don't know that it's in reprints. I'm not sure that it's streaming anywhere. But it was not only funny, there are classic bits in this show, in the length of this show, that belong in any Comedy Hall of Fame. It was also groundbreaking, interesting. The writers very much struck a tone of, sure, we will go out of our way for a great one-liner, but we want first and foremost for this comedy to be grounded in people. In that, it shared a lot in common with the sitcoms of its time, most especially All in the Family. So, if you are of a generation that watched the Mary Tyler Moore Show and fell in love with it, and you don't know about this book, oh my God, you should absolutely read it. I would say that it would still be of interest even if you haven't seen the show. That's how good a job the author does. Then we'll go to a classic here. It says so right on the cover. This is Elizabeth Gaskell. This is her nonfiction. This is the life of her biography of Charlotte Bronte, which has its ups and downs. Of course, Bronte biographies have gone on since then. But Gaskell's also a great writer. And that's rare. That will always be rare for great writers to write respectably and admirable lives of other great writers. Artists in any format tend to be the last people in the world you want to ask to do that. We're going to see that again on this list a couple of times. They tend to be the last people that you want to do that, because as artists, you would expect that they would have more complicated and less objective relationships with their subject matter than even a specialist studying it from an academic standpoint. I don't see that as being true in this book. This book is, I know this is heresy, but for me, far more enjoyable than any of the novels that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote. I guess that would be me. I'm a big fan of nonfiction. But if you're familiar with her novels and you've never tried this, you might want to give it a try. And again, like with some other things that we've mentioned, it will improve if you know more about the Brontes. Then we have Ben Goldfarb. This is a book I could scarcely leave it off a list like this. This is Eager, which is all about beavers and why they matter. This has heaping helpings of beaver natural history, why they do, what the effects of what they do are. Beavers are terraformers. They terraform the landscape. They do it on a scale that only humans can match. And it's amazing. The skill, the engineering insight that they use. Goldfarb is also interested in them as people. having met my share of them in the wild, they aren't very interesting as people. They're kind of a-holes. But he's interested in studying them, going into their lodges, finding out how they live, how they rear their young, what they think about, what they care about. And also he makes the point that terraforming, the thing that beavers do to a landscape, is always only to the benefit of that landscape in the long run. So it's all about that too. It's why they matter. Amazing stuff. The author's geek credentials scream out on every page, but that is actually endearing. Then we have Alfred Heiberger. This is his big biography of the poet Emily Dickinson. My wars are laid away in books. Emily Dickinson is one of the most elusive biographical subjects imaginable, and that makes the accomplishment here all the greater. I don't know that it's fair to say that you will feel like you know Emily Dickinson at the end of this book. I'm not sure that that's possible anywhere, in anything, including very much reading her collected poems. But you will feel that you know Emily Dickinson, and you'll definitely feel that you know her world from this book. It's remarkably atmospheric. We have a little bit of an oddity, one of the oddest books on this list. This is Paul Elie. This is his book, The Life You Save May Be Your Own. And it's got this gorgeous, automatically iconic cover. It's a strange book. It's a study of four figures, literary figures, cultural figures, and their relationship with Roman Catholicism. The most famous study in this book, the thread that runs throughout that's the most famous, is its study of Flannery O'Connor. Its study of Thomas Merton is also wonderful. In my own opinion, by far the highlight of this book is Dorothy Day. But this is memorable. It will stick with you, no matter what you think about these authors, and especially no matter what you think about Roman Catholicism. This will stick with you. This is a classic example of an author going at a book regardless of whether or not there is any possible audience for that book, and it pays off. It absolutely pays off. Then we have a classic, again, says so right there on the cover. This is The Worst Journey in the World by Apsley Cherry Garrard, and this is travel writing at its most epic. This is one of the greatest works of travel writing ever written, and also verifiable, I should say, in reference to Do Travel Writers Go to Hell? All of this was verifiable, but also the most horrifying. This is the author and his crew going to the end of the earth, going to the parts of the earth that don't bear any resemblance not only to the rest of Earth, but to an inhabitable planet, and living to tell the tale. What a story. What an absolutely harrowing story. I mean, travel writers love to do this sort of thing. They love to pile on the horrors. I think because later generations of travel writers knew that part of the selling point of their genre is to make you snuggle all the closer in your warm armchair. They want to pile on the horrors in order to make you enjoy all the more the contrast between where you are and what these actors are going through. This author wrote before that fad, before those marketing crazes, and oh boy, he tops them all. So if you haven't read it, you really should experience it. Then this next one is Killer on the Road. It's a slim book that studies the relationship between serial killers in America and the development of the International Highway, of the Intercontinental Highway. America started a highway boom in the late 1940s and 1950s, and that gave serial killers a greater ability to move around, a greater ability to find their victims and hide their tracks. And this author theorizes about that, gives you a great many details, a great many case studies, links them in time and location, almost you can almost see the pins on a map, to the expanding highway system in America. And it's fascinating. It really is thought-provoking. I've thought about this book for 10 years since I read it. I reviewed it, and I trotted it around the block rather hard because I'm not sure that some of the author's points are correct. I'm a little bit well-read on the subject of serial killers, and I don't think that a lot of the author's contentions about what the highways did to the pattern of serial killers actually bear out, in fact. But it's not going to matter. It didn't matter for me, certainly. If it had just been bad, if it had just been wrong, I wouldn't have been thinking about it all this time. It's really, really thought-provoking. You may come to different opinions than I did, certainly different opinions than the author has. Then an oldie but a goodie. This is not what it looked like originally. This is Archie Carr's book, So Excellent a Fish. You can tell from the antiquated spelling of the word fish that is a quote from a centuries-old document, and this is about turtles. This is about sea turtles. Back when their first exploiters, their first genocidal mass murderers thought that they were a kind of fish or really didn't care one way or another. They're in the water. They're swimming around in the water. They must be fish. This is, as you could tell from that kind of a title, it has a lot of that history in it, and that history is resolutely depressing. But it also has a lot of natural history and some glimpses of the author's present day. It's a very good book on sea turtles, even though it shares the deficiency that a lot of natural history of this type had at the time when this book was written. You could see it all the time in the period this book was written, for instance, in Natural Histories of Whales, which would have 2 chapters on the natural history of whales and 10 chapters on their systematic slaughter at the hands of humans. You just have to put up with that for the gems that these older natural histories have to convey. This is full of gems. We have another limited bookshelf book. I mentioned if you've got just one shelf with books for something like Little Women or The Titanic, here's a book that you'll definitely want to be on that shelf as opposed to the large amounts of dross that otherwise might fill it. This is a case of that. This is probably the definitive book on the subject. This is Phil Sugden's book, The Complete History of Jack the Ripper, which takes into account every aspect of the Ripper's world, his victims, the crime, the manhunt for him, subsequent studies, subsequent theorizing, of course, lots and lots of speculation on the Ripper's possible identity. It's a big, thick, heavy book. It's meant to be studied, I think. It was not meant to be one of the lurid headline grabbers that the subject generates, or used to generate every year. So if you are looking to build out a Jack the Ripper library, a Ripperology library from the basics, from the foundation outward, maybe you're okay with the sensationalistic fluff, provided you know where the foundation is. This is one of the foundations. You're definitely going to want this book. Then we have something by Mark Avery. This is A Message from Martha. And the Martha in question here, as you can tell from the cover, is the last passenger pigeon. Flocks of which once covered whole states in the United States. So if you got one central flock, let's say a Connecticut flock of passenger pigeons, if you got them into the air at the same time, they would blot out the sunlight. And it would take them days to pass over you if you stood still in a field. It would take them days to do that. They were once thought of as so numerous that, much like the American buffalo, they could not ever possibly decrease. They could not ever possibly be gone. People thought that about the passenger pigeon. They thought that about the buffalo. And in the 21st century, people still think that about fish in the sea. It is absolutely not true in any one of those cases. If you cut significantly into the reproductive rates of anything, it will go away, so, which is something that your children and grandchildren are going to learn because they're going to live in a world that doesn't have any fish in the sea. This is a study of that kind of thing. It's a natural history of passenger pigeons and lots of anecdotal history about what it was like to live in an America that had them. But the message here is not that. The message here is take heed. There is no inexhaustible species. There is no inexhaustible wild world. So the message from Martha is don't treat it that way. Otherwise, you'll live in a denuded world, a dangerously denuded world. This is incredibly evocative. It's just incredibly sensitive. It could easily be so mawkish and preachy, but it's not. I strongly recommend it. Then we have a gigantic biography. There are a few gigantic biographies on this list. This is Hermione Lee. She could be on every list that I make like this. She was in my previous one. I'll try to remember to leave a link to the previous nonfiction recommendation video, just so you don't have to go hunting for it. Here she is again. This is her big biography of Edith Wharton, which very nearly completely supplants the previous big fat biography of Edith Wharton by a guy named Lewis that was really, really good. This is, if anything, even better. Mainly because of the literary sensitivity that Hermione Lee brings to the subject matter. It's one thing to assemble all the facts of this author's life. She led a very colorful life, never a dull moment. It's another thing to do that and also be aware of why we care about studying her life in the first place, which is her books. To be really aware of them with a capital A. And Hermione Lee is, more than any other writer, except perhaps the one author who wrote a biography of Edith Wharton and did a really good but very idiosyncratic job. So his book is not on this list, but could be on future lists. This is terrific. It's a big stately thing. So as with any big stately biography, you're going to need patience, which is in short supply in the 21st century. You're going to need to be along for the ride with this author. But if you are, it's definitive. Then we have a multi-biographical study. This is Alec Nalle. This is a book Astounding, about the men who created the golden age of science fiction. Very much sure-footed thing. There's not a foot done wrong anywhere in this book. Nalle obviously very much labored over this thing. You can tell that it sets the right tone and keeps the right tone right from the cover. If this were poorly done, if this were ineptly done, there would be a faded black and white photo on the cover of a few of these knuckle-dragging misogynists at some blurry convention or other. Instead, here you get the people themselves. Some of the authors profiled in this book, and this is not just a series of profiles, it interweaves their personal stories with the birth of a genre. Some of them come off better than others. Some of them were full-fledged monsters. They would be, in the 21st century, resoundingly canceled or even jailed. But some of them aren't, and all of them are interesting. So, and Alec Nalle Lee has a surefire instinct for what's interesting about them. Doesn't let anybody off the hook, but what a book. Oh my. If you are a fan of science fiction, you simply have to read this book. Then we have an idiosyncratic favorite of mine. This is by Jennifer Toth, and like a couple of other books on this list, it has been a bit discredited, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. This is The Mole People. This is her book about the people who live underneath New York City in the vast warrens of tunnels and abandoned subway platforms and whatnot that goes down and down and down and down to subterranean gorges that are still fed by the rapid-flowing rivers that once were above ground in New York. So there are gigantic defiles and gorges down there that never see light unless it's artificial light brought by people who have lived there for generations. Now, as I said, some specialists have debunked some of this or tried to. But it's indisputable that people do migrate down into these tunnels. And it's not just, don't think of just discrete tunnels. There are whole ecosystems 100, 150 feet below the surface of New York City, well below the active subway lines. There are whole stratas of places there that you can go and see. So people do live there. Maybe she's reporting some urban legends as closer to fact than they really are, but The point I'm trying to make about this book is that it's all so delicious. I mean, suspend your Perry Mason hat for just the length of this book. You can verify or not to your heart's content later, but this is such a delicious story. To know that you're walking around on the sidewalk and there are whole civilizations underneath you. It's like something out of a science fiction novel. It's highly recommended. You can fact check it on your own time. Then we have John Long. This is an anthology of his. It's terrific. Again, on the short shelf of books on the subject, this is The Big Drop. This is a book about big wave surfing. Not just its current incarnation, although this stops shy, this is an older book, so it stops shy of big wave surfing being the massive multi-million-dollar, sponsored decals on your shirts and on your wetsuits type of thing that it is today. It stops a little bit short of that. It's still a big business when this book is ending, but he starts with a kind of an oral history of big wave surfing when it was first discovered by white people, when it was just Polynesians who were doing this and doing it in a different way and for different reasons. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating mosaic. Largely because Long kind of gets out of the way of a lot of these people, a lot of these stories. That makes it wonderful. Just gripping reading. And when I was finished, I've read this a couple of times, and every time that I reread it or dip back into it, I always think what an incredibly epic movie this would make. Not the cult movie that is about surfing, but as someone actually doing this. It is possible for one person, if they started as a small child, to live through the whole of the era covered in this book. That would be fascinating if you could do that. If you're a fan of surfing, if you're a fan of big wave surfing, even what later morphed into professional surfing, don't miss this one. This is definitely a keeper. Then we have an older book. This is Idiosyncratic. This is it's a tour of American literature, and as I mentioned a few times on this channel, those can be weird. There's almost no way to write a book like that won't be weird. And the way that saves it, the thing that saves it, is the idiosyncratic aesthetic judgments of the author. You're filtering the literary history of the United States through one person. In this case, it's the literature of the United States. This is an old Penguin paperback. The author is Cunliffe, Cunliffe. And it doesn't purport to be an academic what happened next study, a topography of this subject. It is unabashedly personal. It's comprehensive and extremely erudite, but really, really readable. It's 50 years old, so of course American literature has moved on. But still, if you're interested in that subject and you want to know what one extremely well-read and spikily individual person makes of it all, could scarcely find a more interesting book, if you can find it. Then an oddity. This is admittedly an oddity. I do recommend it. This is The Other Man by Baywatch star Michael Bergen. The reason that Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and John F. Kennedy Jr. are on the cover of this book is because that is the dramatic focus of this book. Mike Bergen was Carolyn Bessette's lover. In a way, in a Pygmalion style way, in the stories that he tells in this book, she makes him. She polishes him for the male model world, makes him more approachable, makes him more finished, and a lot less of a regional Connecticut product. They had a sexual relationship as well. It's moltenly described in this book. It was not at all smooth. She was a troubled young woman. And that sexual relationship continued after she married JFK Jr. So Michael Bergen was the other man. And you would think, from that description, that this would be a loathsome book. This came out after their tragic death. So you'd think this would be a loathsome book on two levels. One, because you're profiting off the death of two famous people. And two, because the method of you profiting off it is to show that you were the snake in the Garden of Eden, that you were helping her to cheat on her husband. This book amazingly avoids both of those. I think because of the immense likability of the central character. I think that's just the way it is. He's so unabashedly honest in this book. I should also point out that it's not all that. There's a lot here about other stuff, about Baywatch, about being a male model, about being a groundbreaking male model when there were only a couple of others who were making this kind of money or getting 200-foot tall billboards in Times Square or whatnot. There are a lot of funny anecdotes and also touching anecdotes about that life. This is not just about leaping out the back door when JFK was driving up to the front door. It's not just about that, although stories like that are in here. It works. It shouldn't, but it does. What I wouldn't give, the aforementioned NDAs, what I wouldn't give for Mike Bergen's account of Baywatch, for his book about Baywatch, what I wouldn't give if that were true. Probably he doesn't want to do it. He's moved on to an entirely different life. Probably he doesn't want to, to bother. Sorry, my technology has acted up just a bit here, but not much. All right, we'll move on to a kind of a literary study. This is a literary study. What a book. What a fascinating book. This is by Yun Tae Hwang, and this is Charlie Chan. The untold story of the honorable detective and his rendezvous with American history. There you have one of the actors who played Charlie Chan on the cover. Charlie Chan, of course, was once upon a time a very popular police sleuth. And this is the story not only of that character, but of the author, the ethos, what lay behind it. It's utterly fascinating. Just utterly fascinating story. Much like the Grapes of Wrath book or the Little Women book, this is an excavation of a literary creation. Unlike those other two, Charlie Chan is a dead literary creation. No one will ever reprint Charlie Chan books, unfortunately. But nevertheless, they are really good to read. And this is fantastic. Just fantastic. It's everything. It's all the stuff that you wanted to know. Even distant, uninformed mystery fans will know that Charlie Chan was perhaps a little bit modeled after a real person. This takes you inside that modeling, inside that story. It's just fascinating. A whole other world. Okay, this next one is a guidebook. It doesn't necessarily have a narrative through line, but you can read it, narratively speaking. It's with mounting horror. This is Stephen Herrero. This is Bear Attacks, Their Causes and Avoidance. The bear on the cover here is a grizzly bear, and the avoidance for grizzly bear attacks is to stay at home. Otherwise, you run the risk. Here, Herrero goes through lots and lots of anecdotal evidence, lots and lots of stories from people who have encountered bears in the wild. Not just grizzly bears, of course, but other kinds of bears. And gives you the basics of what you should do, what you should bear in mind if you are traveling in bear country. In the unlikely event that you encounter a bear, and especially in the unlikely event that you encounter a bear that's interested in you instead of just interested in avoiding you. This is all of that. It's the stories of different encounters and whatnot that really give this its narrative energy. But it is perfect Halloween reading in any case, because it's creep of your flesh. There, but for the grace of God, go scenarios of just from front to back. Again, like with a lot of books on this on this list, how much you enjoy this book will be directly proportional to how much you've experienced its world. If you've never hiked, much less ever hiked in bear country, much less ever hiked in grizzly bear country, then probably this will have less appeal to you. If you have done that, and you somehow have missed this book, I mean, it's practically handed out, with handy wipes at the park ranger booths. So I find it hard to believe you could miss this. But if you somehow missed it and you do this, well, then you should definitely read it. Not just for the prick up your skin thrill of it, but also because it will be really helpful to you. Some of the stuff in it will be really helpful to you. Even if you encounter a grizzly bear who is interested in you, which is really, really, really bad. If that happens, you are the least lucky person in the world. Even if you encounter a grizzly bear that's interested in you, there's still a chance you could survive that encounter, and you up your chances by knowing what Herrero has to tell you. Then we have autobiography. This is an enormous book. This author wrote more books than anybody in the world, and his autobiographies are all gigantic. They're all doorstops, and they are remarkably good reading. You wouldn't think it, because, in my opinion, Isaac Asimov never wrote any fiction that was really remarkably good reading, but his autobiographies are remarkably good reading. I picked one that goes from 1954 to 1978. So when Asimov went from being successful to being mega successful, to being a household name. And this is called Enjoy Still Felt. This is, by the end of this book, he has sort of his signature appearance. At the beginning of the book, he very much does not. In the volume previous to this, he is a dreamboat. It's here that he starts to become Isaac, what everybody in the science fiction world referred to simply as Isaac. And you get the impression when you're reading these pages, it's like 1,000 pages long, it's never dull. And you get the impression when you're reading these pages that Asimov saved everything. I don't know if this is true. I don't know that much about him from the outside. But you get the impression that he saved every receipt, that he jotted down every meeting, every expense, every travel, every taxi cab journey, everything. I find it hard to believe that even he was a prodigious intellect. I find it hard to believe that even he could have recalled all this stuff without those kinds of aids. But God only knows what the closet full of boxes must have been like. But it is transformed in these pages into a very, very involving narrative, believe it or not. Don't know that Asimov's autobiographies are still in print, but they are well worth finding. They make surprisingly good reading. Then we have academic work, a bigger academic work. This is, I think, this is the second edition of the Dinosauria. This is a big book about dinosaurs, which is a fluid subject. It's a moving target because dinosaur studies are always changing. Obviously, if you know anything about dinosaur studies and you read this book now in 2023, you're going to notice right away how much the authors of these articles don't know. There's no way around that. That you want that to be true. you want dinosaur studies to be continuing and expanding and getting more daring and innovative and challenging old assumptions. But there's nevertheless a bedrock that doesn't change, and this is that whole bedrock. This is, in my opinion, the best one-volume reference work on dinosaurs. The surface stuff that changes from one generation to another and from one, study to another, well, that, of course, will vary. I don't know that there was a third edition of the Dinosauria, but the bedrocks don't vary all that much. And some of the chunks in here are unbelievably fascinating. So, again, we're talking about a small shelf here. A small shelf of dinosaur books. The Dinosauria would be on there in one of its two editions. Then we have Ernest Harold Baines. Ernest Harold Baines was a diehard fan of the natural world. He was synonymous with the natural world for a reading public and speech-going public of a century ago, more than a century ago. He wrote a whole bunch of books, and some of them were wee little things made mostly of whimsy. This is one of those, and it is that is not a criticism in any way. This is the Sprite, which is his account of friendship with a fox, with a wild fox. This is a subgenre. There are a number of books about people who form friendships with wild foxes. Foxes are Canidae, they are dogs, they are canines. And so, although they are wild animals, they, as you can see easily on YouTube videos, they are more accessible than most canines, wild canines, to befriending humans. They're always still wild, but they pretty smart. They're urban omnivore hunters, so they're pretty smart. They can assess fairly early on whether or not this big biped creature is ever going to be a threat to them. And if they make the decision, whether it's in your back garden in England or whether it's in the American West or here, if they make the decision that you're not a threat to them, it's amazing how friendly they will be, how present they will be in your life. This is just a tiny little thing. It came and went, but it is just delightful. Just as these books tend to be, they are absolutely delightful. We have a number of human being befriends wild animal books on this list, and they all work. They have a definite enchantment. This next one, a perfect example of that. This is Joe Hutto's book, Illumination in the Flatwoods, where the author, through a series of circumstances that he writes really well, this is a really enjoyably written book, he befriends a group of wild turkeys in the wilderness with creeks and hot days and rattlesnakes and foraging for food, and he doesn't bring any presuppositions to this. He doesn't train them or anthropomorphize them any more than is unavoidable, because they do have personality traits. They are individuals. He doesn't do any of that. He just spends time examining them, and what he realizes is what every writer of every one of these books realizes, which is that they are people. They are three-dimensional people. They are no less individual, no less prone to bad moods or sneezing or practical jokes or senses of humor or varying levels of compassion than human beings. They are people. He comes to that realization. Every writer of these kinds of books comes to that realization, no matter how strange the animal is, the non-human animal is that they're befriending. This is bewitching. Beautifully written and bewitching. Then, oh well, we'll step away from bewitchment here to damnable sorcery, I guess you could say. This is Miriam Griffin's biography of the Roman Emperor Nero. This I forget who the publisher is that did these lamentable cover designs, these sort of exposed negative cover designs for a whole bunch of these things, but this is great. As far as the study of Nero goes, needless to say, Nero has been the subject of a whole bunch of largely dumb, largely salacious books. There was one just this year. There were a couple last year. He's a perennial favorite. He's easy to do. He's an easy punchline. It's very easy to, if you're writing a book about him, to avoid writing a book about him, to avoid doing any kind of serious work. There's all sorts of indications that there was more to this figure than meets the eye. Certainly that more to this figure than the stereotypical one-note historical characterization. And this author digs right into that. So if you want a biography of Nero that doesn't just pander in Fiddling While Rome Burns or whatever, this is the book. It's certainly one to start with. And we'll move on to biographies here. No thematic continuation intended at all. This is Bob Spitz, who I actually love. He's a fantastic biographer. And this is his book, Deary, his biography of Julia Child, who, again, if you're born in the 21st century, you might not know who Julia Child is. If you were a creature of the mid-20th century or later, she would have been a prominent figure, or maybe a parodyable figure. In fact, you would have seen her parodied on Saturday Night Live. But she led a fascinating life. She was not just a cook on TV. She led a fascinating life and was a fascinating person. And you can trust Bob Spitz to find that and to convey it on the page. This is just wonderful. I don't think it's quite as brilliant as his biography of the Beatles, but it's still brilliant. This is still a brilliant author. Then we have Martin Windrow. This is another book about someone who befriends a wild animal. In this case, it's the owl who liked sitting on Caesar. A bad title, but it's because this author adopts a wild owl, and the author has a bust of Julius Caesar, and sometimes the owl will sit on that bust. The owl does a lot of other things too. This is remarkably sensibly done. Books like this are always enjoyable. I find that something about the author reaching outside of the presuppositions and assumptions of their own species tends to elevate the book, no matter what the animal is, whether it's, Born Free, where the animal is a gigantic lion, or so on and so forth. We're going to see other examples on this list. We've seen examples on this list already. Something about this exercise brings out the best in the writer, and this is a talented writer to begin with. So if you like, especially the subgenre of I Befriended an Owl books, this is one you shouldn't miss. Then we have, this is John Craven's book, The Silent War, about submarine warfare. Military history, very nuts and bolts, not for beginners, but fascinating for all that. This is unvarnished, certainly, and fast-paced, surprisingly fast-paced. I would recommend it, again, like a lot of books on this list. I would say you would probably have to be a little bit familiar with submarine warfare, especially modern submarine warfare, to really appreciate this. But if you are, or if you're dead set on wanting to be, and maybe do a little Wikipediaing, this is really ground zero. It really is incredibly informative, incredibly knowing. And the next book is knowing in its own way. This is extremely opinionated, like the Cunliffe book on American literature. This is The Roman Way by Edith Hamilton. This is a genial walk of hers through famous Roman writing. So Virgil, Horace, Catullus, Ovid. This is not meant to be an academic literary study. This is much more impressionistic than that. This is much more along the lines of being introduced to Catullus or Propertius by a passionate reader on that subject who happens to know everything about them. You're going to get all of Edith Hamilton's preferences. You're going to get all of Edith Hamilton's dislikes in these pages. But any of you who've read her book Mythology will know she's a wonderful writer. So it's worth it. She wrote a book called The Greek Way and a book called The Roman Way. They're both wonderful. So if you're looking for a very genial academic walkthrough of the great writers of ancient Rome, it doesn't matter how old this thing is, you're still going to love it. Then we have, this is even older still, this is William Beebe, who was a famous naturalist in his day, 100 years ago. This is The Edge of the Jungle, about him doing often pioneering natural history studies in the jungles of South America. He wrote a number of books that are all fascinating. They're all every bit as fascinating now as they were when he wrote them. I say 100 years, but it might be a little bit less than that. So I'm not 100% sure of the status of William Beebe on, for instance, sites like Project Gutenberg. It's possible that a lot of his works, including this one, might be free. But they are evocative. He is really good at he deserved the fame that he had as a natural history, sort of a bring him back alive explorer who came to tell the normal sedentary workaday public in Boston, San Francisco, and New York what the jungles were like, what the wild world was like, as he himself worked as hard as anybody to throw back those boundaries. We have natural history. This is Lynn Sherr's book, Tall Blondes, which is a book about giraffes. There's a lot of natural history in here, a lot of evolutionary biology about why giraffes are the way they are. There's also a lot of anecdotes in here. This book, to a lesser extent than Illumination and the Flatwoods, but still very much, is haunted by the fact that when the author delves into these worlds, she encounters people. She encounters people. She encounters personalities. Things that should not be in zoos. Things that should not be taught to do demeaning tricks. Things that certainly should not be slaughtered for food, for bushmeat. She encounters people. No two alike. Very different, very interesting people. Complex people. So giraffes are, of course, one of the most evocative animals left in the world. If you find them fascinating and you're always wondering, what would be a good book to read about these things, start with this one. Then we have Charlton Ogburn, who's on my mind recently because I recently reread his enormous book on the real identity of the man who wrote the works of William Shakespeare. The Mysterious William Shakespeare is a huge thing. It's gigantic. It's 1,000 pages long. I was struck when I read it by how immensely readable it is, how wonderfully readable it is. And that fact was on my mind and brought this book up on the list. This is natural history, but not so much of a specific animal species as a natural setting. This is his book, The Winter Beach, which is a biome of its own. It's an experience of its own. Not everybody will have experienced this. Quite a few Americans save up and vacation every year at a beach somewhere. But far fewer of them experience beaches in the off-season, experience beaches in the winter. They're a different kind of world. I've experienced it many, many times, and Ogburn captures a lot of the feeling of that, better than any writer that I've ever seen. So if you have experienced that, or if you haven't experienced it and you kind of want to, it's a book to find. Then we have D. Brown. We'll go back to Dale Van Every for a minute. This is another classic of American Indian history, Native American history. This is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is The Winning of the West. Theodore Roosevelt's The Winning of the West, Manifest Destiny, only from the side of the people you were winning it from. This is an angry and eloquent and heartbreaking evocation of the fact that none of the winning of the West happened in open land. It all happened to be on land that had been occupied for millennia by the losers, by people who didn't have the numbers or the technology to defend that land, or they would still own it today. This has lost none of its power. It's been reprinted 1 million times since it first came out a generation ago. It's lost none of its power. It is still an amazing, eye-opening, angering book. Then we have a weird study here. This is Thomas Dormandy. I don't know how much of this book you'll be able to take. This is The Worst of Evils, and it is a history of mankind's struggle with pain. At its heart, it is that. It is how do people manage pain. Of course, the economic inequalities of how people deal with pain and can be relieved of pain, what kinds of pain there are, the fact that medical science, if you want to call it that, groped in ignorance for millennia before it had any ability to deal with pain at all in any kind of systematic way other than just drugging the patient. So the minute they come out of their stupor, they're in pain again. The different kinds of pain, the ways sociologically, culturally, especially religiously, where it was explained somehow, where spiritual explanations were the only kind of palliative that doctors had to offer. It takes you through centuries and centuries of this, so it makes for unrelievedly grim reading. There was no escape from pain for most of the people who've ever been alive. It's possible that you could argue in 2023 that there is very little escape from pain for most of the people who are alive today. It's very much a province of the rich to escape from pain for the most part. Or the wealthy, at least comparatively speaking, on the world's, a world average. It's fascinating reading. This author does a really good job. This is, I hate to say it, but really the definitive word on the history of pain. It's just, obviously that's a subject that's a bit tough to take, so you want to progress accordingly. And we'll do Marjorie Garber, Friend to Dogs. This is her book, Shakespeare After All, which is a fairly standard Shakespeare book in a way. She goes through all of the works of Shakespeare. But it's wonderful, as any of you will know who've experienced it, in how spirited it is, how accessible it is. This is a person who knows everything there is to know about Shakespeare and the plays, but you never get a sense of exclusion from these considerations of Hamlet or All's Well That Ends Well or whatever. Instead, very much a feeling of inclusion. This is a book to give to someone who wants to understand the body of Shakespeare's work and doesn't know where to begin. This is a great place to begin. But it also works for people who really know Shakespeare. Because Marjorie Garber's interpretations, her viewpoints on all these things, she will inevitably, in almost every chapter of this book, raise points that will be new to you or food for thought for you, even if you know the plays really well. So I highly recommend it. Then we have a big one-volume narrative history of a discrete event. The event is depressing, but the book is brilliant. This is Donald Morris's book, The Washing of the Spears, his big history of the Zulu Wars. If you're wondering what the Zulu Wars are, just picture the winning of the West, Manifest Destiny, an armed horde of white settlers, of white colonialists or imperialist overmasters, encountering the people who've lived on that land for millennia. And those people are not willing to line up and say, okay, when do we start our indoctrination? Instead, they fight. Again, there is no noble savage pandering going on here. Morris is never trying to convince you that this was an unspoiled Eden that was attacked by British colonial soldiers. The tribes fought amongst themselves. They carried on a thriving slave trade amongst themselves. They were often petty, often vicious amongst themselves. Instead, this is just a gigantic clash of arms. And one of the ways that Morris stands out from other books on this subject is that when he shifts, as a book like this inevitably must, to descriptions of battles, he's fantastic. He doesn't lose a step when he goes from personality studies, which are the bulk of this book, to military studies, to the dozen or so capstone military encounters that are a part of any book on this subject. Those are also absolutely thrilling. So this is a big book on a big complex subject that is readable from beginning to end. Then we have, this is a book by Brad Gooch. This is his biography of the great poet Frank O'Hara. This is City Poet. Brad Gooch was not in a position to do this technically, academically, qualifications-wise. He did it anyway. And the book that he wrote is full of magic. It bristles with the empathetic getting to know a young man and a slightly older man. It works, despite or maybe because of his amateur credentials. There'll never be a better book on this figure. This is just immensely involving from start to finish. Then we have another biography. This is by John Lahr. And this is his biography of Joe Orton, the playwright Joe Orton. This is Prick Up Your Ears. I don't know what edition this is. I was just grabbing covers from the internet. But this is a fascinating story, a maddening story, of course a tragic story if you know how it ends or if you're familiar with the movie. Well worth reading. And it has the benefit of City Poet and even Hermione Lee's book on Edith Wharton of irresistibly sending you to the works of the writer. Which is great. A lot of literary biographies don't do that. By the time you're finished with them, you've had quite enough of this figure. The last thing you want to do is go to their literary works. This has the opposite effect, and a greater familiarity with the works of Joe Orton, even on paper, if you can't see one performed, is all to the good. Remarkably heartfelt. A remarkably heartfelt book. Okay, then we'll do another classic. This is by Castiglione. This is his book, The Book of the Courtier. A classic of the Renaissance, where he examines what a courtier's world should be like, how you should present yourself, what is the right thing to do, what is the wrong thing to do. Keep in mind, this would have been a professional aspiration for a lot of well-born people, or people who were just barely well-born enough and thought, well, if I can get a break somehow, then I might be able to be a courtier at such and such a place, or in the train of such and such a person. All I need to know is how to do it. I don't know how to behave when I'm in that job. There were, of course, generations of people in the role of courtier who had been bred to that for generations of their families, so they knew how to do it backwards and forwards. Castiglione is to an alarming degree. He is writing this book for people who are not that. He's writing this book to an amazing degree, an degree not often commented enough on, for climbers. And it is fascinating. It's odd, but I believe in the 21st century, it's less odd than it's been in centuries. Because this is all about how you present yourself to people whose approval can make you wealthy. I think that in many, many ways, I haven't read any essay on this subject, but there's an essay to be written on how the Book of the Courtier lays out the groundwork for social media. There's definitely a book to be written on that. Because this is all about a semi-artificial presentation of a version of yourself to a bunch of people who are going to be judging and maybe preferring you based on that presentation rather than on reality. Reading it with social media in mind is fascinating. But it's fascinating anyway. Find yourself a good annotated edition. The Norton Critical Edition is really good, and just stick with that. Although Castiglione doesn't need much in the way of annotation. There have been only good translations of him. Find a good, solid translation, and you should be good, even without notes. Then we have the historian Stephen Oates. This is his biography of Clara Barton, the American Civil War, a woman of valor. This is unabashedly favorable to Clara Barton, as most biographies are. The author makes very little pretense of the fact that he likes this character. There's a lot that's to be liked. There's a lot that was incredibly brave. Clara Barton attended to the wounded on Civil War battlefields while she herself was under active fire. There are all sorts of interesting figures about her, all sorts of interesting details. History is always like that. It crops up all kinds of details that'll stick with you forever, whether it's that Herman Melville went to his death believing that whales were fish, or that Clara Barton went to her death not believing that germs were real, despite evidence to the contrary in both cases. You'll learn the personality of this remarkable woman. So, an older book, but well worth the time. No better book has ever been written on the subject. Then, we'll talk about a group biography here. Of course, better works have been written on all of the people involved in this book, but it doesn't matter. It's the way it's done. This is Lytton Strachey's classic Eminent Victorians. He takes 4 characters, 4 sacred cows from the Victorian era, and no sacred cow more than Queen Victoria herself, and writes biographical sketches of him. There are 4 people who are the prominent characters in this book, and yet this is not a long book. It's been a perennial bestseller since it first appears because his biographies of these characters are extremely knowing. His prose is cut glass, but they're not reverential. And that shocked a lot of people. It made them feel like they were reading something new in biography. I would argue that they were. I think this is underappreciated for changing the nature of the genre of biography. I know that it's often cited, but I don't think it's appreciated for the seismic explosion that it was in a staid genre, in a very pietistic genre. I think it gave rise to a lot of the biographies that we see today, and a lot of the tics for biographers even who don't like Strachey. And then we move on to the great natural historian and writer David Quammen. I've recommended him many times before. All of his books are wonderful. They're all worth reading. This one is threaded through with heavy-laden portents for the future. All of Quammen's latest books have been like that. This is The Song of the Dodo. And at heart, it's about island biology. It's about animals that are reared isolated from other animals, plants that are reared in island geographies. So there isn't a lot of commerce with the outside world. What does that do to them? And especially how vulnerable does that make them? So the centerpiece of this book is the story of the Mauritius dodo, the great dodo, the silhouette on the cover there, the most famous extinct animal in the world other than the T-Rex. Certainly the most famous exterminated animal. The T-Rex might be more famous as an extinct animal, but the dodo was exterminated by humans. It didn't just go extinct naturally. It was killed by humans. And the reason for the portent is because the steady theme in this book and a couple of Quammen's other later books has been that there is no such thing as island biography anymore. We are all island biographical species now. The world is wide open. And what does that mean? Where does that underscore our own vulnerabilities? Could you perhaps lay the whole world waste by a novel coronavirus that was restricted before you encountered it, before relentless open roads everywhere encountered it and spread it all over the world in a matter of 2 weeks? Say, using that as a hypothetical. There are deeper strands running through this book that are wonderfully done. This author is so good. He's just so good. Then we have G.E. Bentley's big biography of William Blake, The Stranger from Paradise. I'm not a big fan of William Blake. I'm not a fan of his writing, especially not a fan of his artwork. Well, of course, it doesn't matter. When you're in the hands of a great biographer, that doesn't matter. And that doesn't matter in this case, certainly. This is the best Blake biography that's ever been written. It's amazingly good. It's also, if you can find the original hardcover, it's ornately done. Blake himself would have approved of how pretty a product that hardcover was. But it captures a lot more than just the easy voice in some of the much more famous of the poems. It captures much more than that. Blake, of course, was much more complicated than that. Same thing with this next figure, a dauntingly complicated character who's often reduced. This is Janet Brown. This is one of her books on Charles Darwin. This is Voyaging. So it mostly deals when he was out and about in the world as a young man on the Beagle and elsewhere. There are other volumes, and I think Janet Brown also wrote a one-volume abridgment of her multi-volume Darwin biography. This is in many ways the most remarkable of them all. The Darwin who retires to his nice country cottage and ruminates on publishing On the Origin of Species, but doesn't do it for decades. That's not so interesting a figure as this. The Darwin who's out and about learning about the world and simply seeing it. Just a guy who goes down a gangplank. Maybe he's not got his land legs underneath him. He's just looking around, and it's just the way human history turns on wool staples just like that, where the one set of eyes will come along, see something that millions of sets of eyes have looked at before, and see something different, and ask different sets of questions. This book is all about that. It's thrilling, just thrilling. Then we have another biography here. This is Lee Montville's biography of the American baseball star Babe Ruth. Those of you who are not in America will not have much of a conception of the cultural hold that baseball used to have on this country. It doesn't have that hold anymore. But once upon a time, for 100 years, it was church. It had a hold even greater than religion. This is his book on Babe Ruth, The Big Bam. Babe Ruth had a fantastic, interesting life. That is not true with a lot of subjects of baseball biographies. With a lot of subjects, if you don't know the game, you will not be interested in the book. You'll need to know the arcana of the game, or you will be bored stiff in a lot of chapters. That's not true with Babe Ruth. One of the few baseball players, I would say, where that's not true. You don't need to know the game. Montville is extremely good at explaining games, so you're not going to need to worry about that anyway. And I don't know why I'm pitching this book to people who don't know anything about baseball, since, of course, 99.9% of the people who would be interested in reading this will be people who do know about baseball. Babe Ruth was a larger-than-life figure. That is a term that is often cavalierly tossed around, but in his case, it was absolutely true. And Montville captures those moments fantastically. The larger-than-life moments. Babe Ruth had probably a dozen of them, whereas most people don't have any, or maybe one. But Montville is also very good at conveying the pathos of the older Babe Ruth, who didn't want to be larger than life. He just wanted a job. He wanted to be taken seriously as something other than the cartoon character that he had willingly made himself. That part of the story, of the Babe Ruth story, is really touching. I've often thought that it deserves a book of its own, but I don't know that any such book exists. Montville's really good on all the aspects of the Babe. So, of the Sultan of Swat, the Wazir of Wham. And then we'll move on to someone who I don't think cared much about American baseball. This is Virginia Woolf. This is her abridgment, an abridgment of her diary. Her diary went for many, many volumes. A Moment's Liberty is an abridgment of that diary. She's amazing in her diary pages. She really is. I'm not sure that she's so amazing in her diary pages that you would want the unabridged diaries. You occasionally see them at used bookstores. I'm not sure that you would want that. I'm not sure that you wouldn't end up skimming, and maybe the final volumes in that long, long series you probably wouldn't touch at all. Whereas A Moment's Liberty really does service to that by abridging. It's a really good abridgment that really, really conveys what she was like on her diary pages, which is half swanning for the camera and half remarkably intimate. Really, really good stuff. Then we'll move back to natural history. This is a fairly recent thing. This is Cy Montgomery's book Of Time and Turtles. This is another turtle book. I could have made 50 turtle books on this list because they're fairly easy to study and they're immensely charismatic. So they have generated lots and lots of books. This is the latest one. Cy Montgomery, of course, will be famous for a lot of you for her book on octopuses. This is every bit as enchanting. She has such an amazing way of writing this kind of book. It's not taxing on you. It's full of natural history, but that is not done in any kind of hyper-detailed way. if you know this author, then you'll know what to expect. This is charming and incredibly accessible. You could hand this thing to anybody, whether they were interested in turtles or not, whether they're interested in natural history or not. You could hand it to them and they will be just caught up in it. And it's in your bookstores. Unlike pretty much anything else on this list, it's in your bookstores now at the time that I'm making this video. Then we have Zach Fitzner. This is a bit harder of a sell when it comes to reptiles. This is Tears for Crocodilia. A really remarkable book, a really heartfelt book about an entire family of reptiles that goes back a long time. They go back to the dinosaurs. They are often not loved. They have always been the subject of rampant poaching and rampant hunting, extermination campaigns. This is full of the natural history of crocodilia, and it is fascinating. You wouldn't want to meet one of these creatures, but they are endlessly fascinating. So if you are in that boat where you wouldn't want to meet one, maybe don't want to know about them, you're wrong about the second part. You don't want to meet one of them. You definitely don't want to meet one of them. And you want to observe a standard rule for crocodilia, whether it's in Florida or in Africa. You want to observe a standard rule. If you're driving down the highway and it's an industrial park in Florida, you've got buildings on either side, office buildings, parking lots, shops, and flags and gas stations and whatnot, and you maybe pull into a little driveway or a little parking space, and there's landscape lawn with an office building, and part of the landscape lawn is a little ditch, a little pond. You'd be wrong to call it a pond. It's man-made. It's just a stretch of water that just happens to be there in order to alleviate the scenery. There is an alligator in that water. Don't think otherwise. Don't bring your little dog near the edge of that water. The standard rule of thumb for crocodilia is in any standing body of water, a bunch of water in a road, in a truck rut on a road in Africa, there is a crocodile in that water. There is a crocodile there. There is an alligator in that pond. Just assume that. Don't go anywhere near the edge, because they're surprise predators. They will take your dog. Or you, or your kid, if they see the main chance. But anyway, we'll move on to another biography. This is absolutely terrific, from a legend in the classical music field. This is John Eliot Gardner's biography of Johann Sebastian Bach, Music in the Castle of Heaven. Bach has had a million biographies, of course, but this is really heartfelt. The one caution that I would observe in terms of recommending it is that it leans rather heavily on musical knowledge, much the same way that a recent biography, recent at the time of this filming, of Schubert, did the same thing. Not exclusively and not off-puttingly, but I guess my only caution is that you'll get a lot more out of this book if you understand music than if you don't. Which kind of makes sense with the Bach biography. Bach also led a fascinating life, and much like Babe Ruth, he also at times did things that don't make any sense. I'm not talking about sabotaging his own professional career. I'm saying at times his specialty took him beyond what seems human. Though that kind of not making sense. The Babe did that a few times regularly in his career, and Bach did that. Just you have to listen to his music to see that. But this very much humanizes him. Of course, he was a very human figure. I have read a lot of Bach biographies. I think this is one of the best ones. Then we have Nick Taylor. This is an odd sell. I had a hard time selling this to customers in bookstores. This is American Made. This is his history of the WPA. The Works project that Franklin Roosevelt implemented to put Americans to work during the Great Depression and in the ramp up to World War II. It was building roads. It was shoring up train tracks. It was building walls and public works. It was writing. It was a whole bunch of things. The WPA was a broad umbrella of federal money that was available for federal works projects. And you would think, I know because I talked to a lot of customers who did think, that is a boring subject. It's the history of a social program. How interesting could it be? But Taylor does an incredible job with this book. It will be the biggest nonfiction surprise you have in months, because you won't be able to put it down. It is that good, even though it doesn't seem like it would be. So it's a strong, strong recommend. Then we have Linda Godfrey. This is a charming book. It will madden you. It maddened me, but in a good way, in a fun way. This is I Know What I Saw. This is her venturing into the station wagons and the RVs and the coffee klatch meetings of people who have seen the paranormal. They don't have any proof, of course. They don't have any unambiguous, clear photographs or video footage. but they're certain. And their refrain, as you will know if you encounter these people, is the title of this book. I know what I saw. Call me crazy, but I know what I saw. The counter argument to I know what I saw is counterintuitive, so most people don't get it. The nature of critical thinking is the counterintuitive to this. If you are out in your backyard, maybe you've got the dog out for the evening's walk in your backyard, and over the fence to your backyard in the field that adjacents to your property, you see an African elephant just sort of amble by. Maybe your dog barks at this African elephant as it ambles by. And you're stunned. You don't have your camera with you. You're just stunned. What on earth? What on earth? Is this thing escaped from a zoo? It ambles by. It's got forest on one side and your property on the other, so there isn't anyone else seeing it. It ambles by out of sight. You gather up the dog and you rush inside. You put on your go outside clothes and you immediately start examining the neighborhood. Well, okay, you can't find anybody else who saw this thing. It's 10 feet tall, 7 tons. There are other houses adjacent to yours on either side. You can't find anyone else who saw this thing. Your neighbor would have walked right past the window of their kitchen. And they were in the kitchen at the time. No one saw this thing. There are also no footprints in the soil, in the gravel, in the grass, and there are no droppings. There's no reports of an African elephant anywhere else along the path it would have had to taken or the path it would have had to go. The bedrock of what is called critical thinking is for you to assess all of that information and say, I was mistaken. No matter what I know I saw, I could not have seen it. Reality does not support my conviction. So I must have been mistaken, no matter how sure I am. That's the fundamental basis of critical thinking. And no one in this book understands that, including, I suspect, the author. And that ends up making it charming. In the long run, it ends up making it charming. It's the point that I wanted to stress by that illustration is the one that will be on your mind the whole time you're reading the book, which is that I know what I saw. It does not say anything. That is not proof of anything. But anyway, then we'll move on to a book that had a lot of popularity. A lot of you will know this book. A lot of you might even have it. This is Robert McFarlane's book, Underland, which is a study of underground. Not just burrows and mines and tunnels and whatnot, or subterranean rivers or seismic architecture, but also the mythology, the folklore that has arisen up around things being underground on the part of human beings for millennia. Coming all the way up to the present day. Edgar Rice Burroughs made a whole civilization that was underground, and so on and so forth. You'll be familiar with a lot of folklore, right? Quite a few organized religions locate their netherworld under the ground, as opposed to up in the clouds. This is, that's a fairly low-hanging subject. This author mainly saves this book by being so eloquent. It's such a wonderfully readable book that although it is in every last molecule predictable, you're still going to love it. It's still a wonderfully evocative reading experience. And then we have Mary Lovell's book. This is her biography of Beryl Markham. This is Straight On Till Morning, her biography of the groundbreaking aviatrix, Beryl Markham. A terrific biography. I tried not to make this just a list of biographies, but this is really evocative, much like Babe Ruth. Beryl Markham led a fascinating life from start to finish, so well worth your time. Then we have a very slim thing. This is Glenn Maxwell's meditation on poetry. And there is an amazing insight into what poetry is and also what poetry is not on every page of this book. Just utterly remarkable. Meditation books, just sort of chin-stroking, leather arm patch meditations on a particular genre, are usually open invitations to deadly tedium. And instead, this is unbelievable lightning on every page. Whether you end up agreeing with Maxwell on a lot of his pronouncements about what poetry is, and especially what it isn't, or not, you're still going to find this just endlessly underlinable. At least I did. The poets that I've shown it to felt the same way. Then we have a book by Susan Marks. This is her study of Betty Crocker, Finding Betty Crocker, America's foremost homemaker who did not really exist. Who had her own show, her own books, her own recipe column, her own everything. This is a study not only of where Betty Crocker came from, but what was her appeal for so long, for 2 whole generations of American homeowners, of American housewives. What was her appeal And the author does a lot of really good thinking on that subject. Again, this could be a very easy book to write, but instead the author really digs down deep and does a wonderful job of it. So you wouldn't believe that Betty Crocker would be a subject that would hold your interest in a book, but you'd be wrong. Then we have R.D. Rosen. R.D. Rosen did something that is self-evidently insane. And the only benefit that you can get from doing something that's self-evidently insane is to write a great book about it, in my opinion. Taking us back to the worst journey in the world. The only thing that justifies an insane decision is to write a great book about it. And he did. He decided to let an American buffalo live in his house, walk around on their surprisingly dainty feet, deposit their wheelbarrows full of crap wherever, bump into things, of course. And that's his book, A Buffalo in the House. Naturally, the family fell in love with this animal. And again, a point I've made a few times in this video, when Illumination in the Flatwoods or anything else, the buffalo also fell in love with them, and not as a source of food. What the family discovered and their friends discovered by having a buffalo in the house, which is a self-evidently insane thing to do, is that this is a person. This is a person. It thinks it's a people, but this is a person. Complex, multi-layered, sometimes self-contradictory, sometimes different moods. But those of you who have read, for instance, speaking of Cy Montgomery, those of you who have read her book, The Good, Good Pig, about Christopher Hogwood, will know exactly what I'm talking about. The minute you take these animals out of their exploitative context and just get to know them, you find there is a person there to get to know. That is fascinating. I, of course, don't advise having a buffalo in your house. I once, for 16 years, had a basset hound, and that's pretty close. I can tell you. It's awful nerve-wracking. We'll go back to a big fat biography. This is Julian Jackson. This book was enormously praised. It was praised by everybody. This is a big biography of Charles de Gaulle. All the way through, de Gaulle was also larger than life, not only physically, as you can see, he towered a foot over most people that he knew, but also his life is larger than life from start to finish. So it's a natural subject. There have been lots of other big doorstop biographies of de Gaulle. I honestly think this is the best one. That could be recency bias on my part. It could be that the next one that comes out I will think, but I don't think so. I think the next big soup to nuts de Gaulle biography that comes out will just be measured against this thing and found wanting. This is remarkably involving writing for such a long book. Then we'll go back to natural history, and this is a theme that runs throughout here. There's a kind of natural history in which, much like Buffalo in the House or Owl Who Liked to Sit on Caesar or whatnot, there's a subgenre of natural history books where the writer takes a wild animal into their home, at least partially. I think those books bring out the best in their writers, and we have a few more to go on this list. This is by Grace Marmer Spruck, and this book is what happens when you're in your apartment in New York City, you've got a fire escape outside the window, and you put a nut on that fire escape, and it attracts a squirrel. What would happen if you did not call a halt to that process? What would happen if you put out more nuts and maybe tested to see which kind of nuts the squirrels prefer? It's filberts that they prefer. And what if more squirrels came and you started to get to know which ones were coming and what they were like, what kind of, again, people they were? And then what if you went one step further and left the window open so that the squirrels could come inside and ask you for more filberts and maybe climb on top of you or run around inside the house from time to time? If you did that, you would get this, Such Agreeable Friends, in which the author does exactly that. This is enchanting, just enchanting. It's infuriating in one way because the author is clearly experiencing Stockholm Syndrome. The squirrels in this book never become very friendly. Squirrels are not very friendly. As this author makes a point of saying over and over again in this book, their standard way of asking for attention is to punch you with their tiny little fists. That's how they do it. They punch you to get attention. But it's remarkable anyway. It's just shot through with affection for these creatures that start showing up in their multitudes to get their nuts and also to explore the apartment. We get to know individuals. The book is full of individual squirrels. And there's another element here that will strike some of you, especially those of you who live in the urban Northeast. Amazingly, it's a note that will definitely jump out at you, which is that how livable this author's apartment was. The apartment where all of this is happening would probably go for $3 or $4 million on the market today. She was just paying rent on a normal apartment, a normal walk-up apartment in New York. It's not an intended element. Of course, writers can't ever know how their books are going to age, but it will stick out to you if you rent in the Northeast. But as a squirrel book, I mean, squirrels are one of the few types of wildlife that all of us know. And as a result, this is remarkable. Then we have a doorstop of a thing. This may, in fact, be the longest book ever written. This is Vincent Bugliosi's book, Reclaiming History, which is his study of the JFK assassination, second by second, microsecond by microsecond. He examines not just the JFK assassination, which is a huge start of this book, but also every theory that has ever been put forward to explain it, every conspiracy theory about this. So this is a 1,500-page book, which obviously means that much like a lot of other books on this list, you're going to have to be interested in the subject, very interested in the subject. But if you are, the amazing thing about this book, some of you will know this author from Helter Skelter, his book Helter Skelter, and you may have a taste for what I'm about to say. It seems unbelievable. It seems impossible to do. This is actually unbelievably readable for all of its 1,500 pages. That doesn't seem possible, but it's true. So you would have to be interested in this subject, very interested. But if you are, oh my, you won't stop reading. It'll take you a long time to do. It took me a long time to do, but it is worth it. Absolutely worth it. Then we have a book by Mark Leopold. This is a biography, but it's also a study of biography. It's a study of how we know what we know. And one of the best ways to really study that kind of a question is to pick an extremely controversial figure and examine the controversy. How much of the controversy is actually a testable fact? Well, Mark Leopold finds such a figure in Idi Amin. And this is a biography of Idi Amin, but it is also a study, more so, a study of how we know what we know about Idi Amin and the monstrous atrocities that are attributed to him, including cannibalism. What do we know about him? We know a lot about him when he was driven out of power, because he was resident somewhere else and was watched night and day. He was domesticated. But what about the stories of when he was in power and his rise to power, his bloodthirsty, hatchet-wielding rise to power? How much of that is vilification, if any? And how much of that is verifiably true? Spellbinding. You would never in a million years think it, with a figure as repulsive as Idi Amin, you would never in a million years think that a book like this could be so good. But it is so good. It is so entertaining, even on such a dark subject. Really, really worth it. Then we'll pick another gigantic soup to nuts biography. This one has been maligned as being done by a so-called court historian. It's brilliant. I defy you to show me any bootlicking that takes place anywhere in it. The author is Arthur Schlesinger, who did a long book on President Kennedy. This is his book, Robert Kennedy and His Times, about RFK, not JFK. It's longer than his Kennedy book, and really fascinating. It really is. Robert Kennedy, again, as an adult, led a fascinating life almost day by day, and Schlesinger just does it justice. I would agree with critics who would say that there is a bit of a homiletic feeling to his Kennedy book. That is largely gone from this book. RFK did not inspire the kind of loyalty that JFK did. It's a kind of a signature, an ironic twist to this book that JFK gets all the best lines. He dominates the parts of the book that he is in, even though it's about his younger brother. But this is not a study of the weird shadow cast by RFK on American history. There are better books on that subject, including some that are just recent, just a few years ago. This is more a study of the man, and it's page-turning reading. It's a very long book, but it's page-turning reading. Then we'll move to a dark subject. They don't get much darker than this. This is Kevin Cook's book, Waco Rising, also a fairly recent book, just a couple of years old. This is about the siege, the federal siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, and the horrific endgame, as you can see on the cover. The compound burned to the ground. And was bulldozed. You can go there today. You'll see no trace of it whatsoever. A lot of people lost their lives in that final act, including a lot of terrified children. And the narrative branches off. It branched off from the minute this became news. Between those people who died were the victims of a messianic cult leader, David Koresh, or those people were the victims of an overreacting federal government. Cook's book is probably the best book on this subject that will ever be written. Any future comprehensive soup to nuts history of Waco will have to be done without any living survivors. There were living survivors of this. Cook has access to all of that, and it's an amazing performance. It's a grim subject, but it's an amazing performance. If you live through that history, for instance, you're going to want to read this book. Then we'll get Zach Davison. We'll go from something grim to something not quite so grim. This is his book, Yurei, a rather charmingly designed hardcover of Japanese ghosts, of the ghosts that rise out of wells on boiling hot Japanese summer evenings. You wouldn't think, I mean, those stories have featured in everything from Lafcadio Hearn to the present day. You wouldn't think that such a good narrative could be knitted together from that folklore, but this author does it. He does it. It's not a long book, and it's really well illustrated. It's a really well-produced thing. It is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. He did a subsequent book on haunted cats that naturally did not appeal to me as much, but this book, any ghost story aficionado, if you've got a shelf of ghost story collections, this has got to be on that shelf. Absolutely. Then we'll do R.D. Lawrence's book. This is another book about befriending a wild creature. This is his book, Paddy, about a wild beaver. Sold like crazy once upon a time. Don't think it's in print anymore. It had a Vogue, but I don't think it's in print anymore. Much like the Goldfarb book, the beavers are strange. They're odd little nudniks of the animal kingdom. They're not particularly lovable. They're business-oriented, very much task-oriented. They'll remind you of some people that you know. You love them in spite of themselves. This book really captures that. And it also gives a lot of natural history about beavers. Just a lot. So really, really, really good stuff. Same thing with this next one. You get a lot of natural history of the animal in question, but also attempts are made to humanize an animal that they are not particularly likable. This is the husband and wife team of Gus and Margie Mills, and this is their book, Hyena Nights and Kalahari Days, where they study the brown hyena of the Kalahari. It's natural history, which is really weird. It's physiology, which is really weird. It's behavior, which is these are really weird animals. They look like dogs, but they're not. Trust me. They're not. They're not dogs. They're instead a weird holdover from the Pleistocene there. And it takes something to study them. There have been a few really enchanting books about hyenas, even though they themselves are not enchanting animals. They're savage and brutish. They're prone to vicious biting, even when they like you. They're as inhospitable a subject for natural history as, for instance, camels would be. But these two managed to make a gripping narrative out of this subject anyway. I don't think they will ever quite make you like their subject, but nevertheless. Then we have Chris Gosden's book. This is his history of magic. Also a relatively recent book. I think this came out in the last 10 years. There have been a lot of histories of magic, the roles that it played in human culture, human history throughout the ages. This is one of my favorite ones. I'm by no means an expert on the subject, but this is consistently page-turning. It was consistently interesting. And unlike a lot of modern histories of magic, it does not require you to believe that magic is real. Magic is not real. There is no such thing as your truth and my truth. There is only the truth. And the truth is what you can prove. It's what you can demonstrate. So you can believe it to your heart's content, but you can't teach it in school as being real. You can't give someone a degree in magic. Just in the study of magic, in history. And this does a really good job of that. It's a really good example of that. Then we'll go to another example of a specialist. We've already seen a specialist in one field writing about another specialist in that field. Those books are ordinarily a recipe for disaster. Not in this case. This is one of the most remarkable examples of this that I've ever seen, of an actor writing an actor's biography. This is Simon Callow's series of books on Orson Welles. I could pick any book in this series. I picked The Road to Xanadu because it's the compelling young Wells. But they're all the books in this series are fantastic. If you see them at your Oxfam chapter or charity or shop or whatnot, grab them all. Simon Callow is incredibly insightful into Wells. You would think that it wouldn't work, but it does. In fact, it works better than a normal biographer because Simon Callow knows his world. Knows Wells's world. He doesn't, unlike a lot of other biographers, he doesn't have to learn that world in order to convey it to you. He knows it inside and out. So this makes just spellbinding reading. Then we have Andrew Chaikin. This is his book on a great subject, A Man on the Moon. This is a big narrative history of the Apollo space missions, of the missions to put human beings on the moon, for human beings to visit the moon in person. All the setbacks, all the personalities, all the triumphs, that the exquisite moment when you realize that it's real, that contrary to conspiracy theorists, that We have actually walked on that satellite that's up in the sky. The handful of men who were able to walk around for the rest of their lives and look up at that and say, I've been there. Amazing. There have been a slew of books on the subject. I still think Chaikin's book is the best one. It's the most detail-rich and also the most readable. Then we have Laura Bates. This is a grim subject. She does a great job on it. This is Men Who Hate Women. And it's about the gigantic internet subculture or internet-fueled subculture of violent misogynists. Laura Bates actually explored that world. She created alternate identities for herself to go and look at that world, to go on their chat boards, find out what these men are actually saying behind the closed doors in their closed communities. She couldn't do that in person, of course, but she could do it online and learned a lot. All of it terrifying. Terrifying because of how plausible it is. Of course, later on, when her identity became known, those chat rooms wanted nothing more than to kill her and fantasized about it in enormous detail without seeming to care that she still had access to their dialogue and could see these fantasies. She's an insightful writer, doesn't let her emotions get carried away. This is a very enraging subject, and she doesn't let that take over the narrative. Instead, she's examining this as a sociologist would from Mars, which makes it all the more terrifying. Just absolutely essential reading. Same thing with this next one, where Alexandra Minna of Stern does the same thing, goes at an enraging subject, but with clinical dispassion in order to understand it better. This is Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State. Very great degree of overlap between these two. In both cases, these young men between the ages of 18 and 25 are driven to this radical ideologies largely because they have the mistaken impression that society has robbed them of the kingdoms that would otherwise be theirs. This book is slimmer than The Men Who Hate Women, but it packs a punch. This is also obviously some very dangerous research that this author did in order to bring back this study. I don't know of any study on this subject that's any better. I know some that are longer, and one that's more recent, at least one, but none that are any better. Harrowing reading, sobering reading. It'll make you look at the guys on the bus or the subway or in the library a lot different. You'll be wondering. Sure, they're saying hi to me, and when I ask them, could you watch my stuff while I go outside for a drink of water, they smile and agree. These two books will make you wonder where they're spending their internet time. And you'll be hoping that it's just endless hours of World of Warcraft. You'll be hoping for that. Then we have an older book. Joseph Dean did this years and years and years ago. This is Hatred, Ridicule, or Contempt. This is his classic study of libel cases in the court system, the British court system. Lots and lots of transcripts here. Lots and lots of fascinating details. Very much along the line of notable trials or Roughhead's book on true crime. Only here, there aren't any real victims. There's a lot of the people who've suffered libel or contempt in these court proceedings as they're laid out in these pages are so insufferable that you're just cheering for the people who maligned them. This is just, if you can find it, it is a wonderful, wonderful palate cleanser of a book. Although it's not a cheap or a dumb book. There's analysis too. Then we have Mark Giroux. Mark Giroux wrote, he did a lot of studies of country houses, English country houses, and what they meant. And the groundbreaking study of his was Life in the English Country House, where he examines what these things were. They weren't just big, opulent vanity projects. There was a lot of power brokering that happened. They were meant to convey a lot of messages. It's fascinating. I have a whole shelf of books on English country houses. They fascinate me anyway, but none of them delves into them like this. This is a thinking person's version of those kinds of books. This is not just, here's the local ghost, or here's the local story, or whatnot. This is delving into what country houses were, what they did in the societies that gave them birth, up to the present day. Then we have Robert Gutman. This is a gigantic biography. Sometimes if you want to read a biography, it has to be gigantic. Same thing with the Bach book. This is his biography of Mozart, 1,000 pages long, big brick of a thing. Really, really readable. I would argue that maybe if you're really interested in this subject, and who isn't interested in Mozart also led a non-stop interesting life. I would argue if you're really interested in this subject, maybe go onto the secondhand market online and find a hardcover that looks like this. The American trade paperback of this was printed in the gazillions, but it's not a well-made trade paperback. You might be attracted by the price, but it won't hold up well, whereas the hardcover is really well made. So in this case, if you want a print and paper book of this, I would suggest that you get the hardcover. But it's all of Mozart, just everything. And really good on the music as well. Then we have Katie Hafner and Matthew Lyon wrote a weird book. This is going to appeal to only a handful of you, but those it does, you shouldn't miss it. This is Where Wizards Stay Up Late. This is the origins of the internet. Not just in Silicon Valley, but in a whole bunch of different places, as you can see from the cover art. This is what was the internet, the parts of it that were DARPA and that were DARPANet and the parts that weren't. How did it all come together into this thing that is so indispensable to all of us? It's how I'm talking to you right now. It's a part of all of our lives. How did this happen? And who were the people there at Ground Zero? None of those people are anybody you'd want to take home to mother, but they're fascinating to read about. This is you'll have a smile on your face the whole time, even though it's a fairly serious subject. Now, and then we have a really good author writing a really good book about a subject that history has largely ignored. This is The Korean War by Michael Hickey. This is tremendously done. This is big, muscular, detailed narrative history the way it should be done, about a war that is most familiar to people from the TV show MASH, rather than for what it was or for its actual people, its actual personalities. You could rectify that. You will not find this difficult going. This is really good narrative military history. Then we have, we're going to go from that out of it. So that was not planned, but we're going to go to another very good author. This is a book that will make, you will argue with it. I've never met anyone, I've recommended this book to 1 million people. I've never read anyone who read it calmly. This is John Gardner's book on moral fiction. It's full of the author pontificating about writing and about books, about authors. I don't know that there'll be 2 consecutive pages of this book that you'll agree with, but oh my God, you will never stop rereading it. Never. You will love it for that fact. And it will also make you dig in and think about how fiction works on the page. What fiction is trying to do. What makes it work and what doesn't. Well worth your time to spare. It's not a long book. It's well worth your time to find a copy and sit down with it, especially if you mostly read fiction, you poor misbegotten people. If you mostly read fiction, then you're going to want to read Gardner on fiction. He wrote a few books on the subject. Then we have Barth David Schwartz. This cover is a second edition, but this is a classic work of biography. This is Pasolini Requiem, about the Italian polymath, the director and the writer and whatnot. There are some biographies. This is a big doorstop of a thing. I'm glad it has a reprint. That means there'll be paperbacks out there you can find. There are some biographies that really rise to the level of artwork. They aren't just the author showing up and presenting their research. I've tried to show you some of those in this video. City Poet is a very good example of that. This is also an excellent example of that. And one of the defining characteristics of that kind of biography is that you do not have to like or know about the subject. You're still going to find it fascinating. And that's what this is. This is, the author varies from the very micro-focus to much broader assessment of Pasolini's accomplishments, and it's all fascinating, whether you know about Pasolini or not. Then we have a weird little book. This was put together ad hoc. This is A Very Private Eye. It's a book about Barbara Pym. It has lots of her nonfiction, lots of her letters and abortive diary attempts and whatnot, autobiographical sketches of one kind or another. It's kind of a potpourri, not a full-scale biography, but all the more fascinating for that. This author, in her own words, is better than any biographer could be. It's a shame that she's not better loved by the literary establishment today. She deserves it, but she's not, as far as I know. She's known, and her adherents are passionate. This is as close as we'll ever get to her autobiography, to a real consistent soup-to-nuts book about her. And it's endlessly fascinating. And again, I would say that you don't need to know her books to really enjoy A Very Private Eye. Then we have Francesca Peacock did a book on another fascinating woman. This is her biography of the great Margaret Cavendish, pure wit. I would argue that in order to understand Margaret Cavendish was a fascinating figure, led a fascinating life, was a trailblazer in a lot of different literary forms. And I would argue that in order to get the most out of this book, despite its wonderful introductory chapter, you should probably read up a little on Margaret Cavendish from Wikipedia or elsewhere before you start this, but just a little bit. Peacock is good. It's good to you can put yourself in her hands for the rest of it and learn a lot about a figure you might not know, who's really, really interesting. And then we have Sigurd Olsen went to Lake Superior 100 years ago and wrote a nature book. Just walked around, noticed what he could notice, experienced nature, sat still for long periods of time. He wrote a book called The Singing Wilderness, all about the sounds of that area, there are large tracts of that area up around the north of Lake Superior where you can experience a lot of what he experienced today. This is illustrated. This original, I don't believe this was ever had a reprint, so you would have to, the illustrations are by Francis Jacques, and they're wonderful. They would fill the volume that you would find secondhand. You would have to find this secondhand. If you live in that area, or are a fan of going out into the wilderness and simply listening, this is the book for you. You're going to love it. It's heartfelt, wonderfully done, and unlike a lot of books on the subject of that nature, it's not full of shooting animals, which is great. And then we have James Turner. James Turner wrote a big book. This is a little bit inaccessible. It's really well done. And the parts of it that are accessible, there are chunks of it that are accessible, are really accessible. This is his big study of philology, which is kind of abstruse. I admit, this is probably one of the chanciest things on this whole video. But his viewpoint is that the study of philology lies at the heart of the humanities itself. There's not just one specialized sliver study of the humanities, but rather it's at the heart of everything. And that it's kind of fun to watch him try to make that unmakeable case. His introduction, a lot of his introductory parts to different sections of this book are wonderful, despite the fact that it's an abstruse subject that a lot of you will have to look up to know what it is. Believe it or not, this is a book that you could pick up on that subject and read and enjoy. It's actually enjoyable. And then we have, this is by Thomas Slaughter. This is his book, Independence. It's a study of the roots of the American Revolution, but as you can tell from the cover illustration, it's not a comfortable subject. It's not those brave men. It's not the British are coming, the British are coming. Here you have someone being tarred and feathered, someone being force-fed boiling hot tea. So you have this is a sarcastic newspaper illustration of someone having his entire body destroyed. That's happened often. Tarring and feathering was a horrifying procedure. Don't make how funny it looks blind you to the fact that it ruined your life. The same thing here. Officials would have boiling hot tea poured all over their face, poured down their gullet. That destroys you for life. Same thing as tarring and feathering does, or being ridden out on a rail. This book it throws a light on that aspect of the American Revolution, that this was not a peaceful thing at all. It was incredibly violent. Not just on the eastern seacoast, not just in New York and Boston, but also in the hinterlands. The hinterlands weren't very hinter at the time, but still, in the hinterlands, ugly things happened to British officials, to the huge amount of royalists who did not agree with the revolution. They were Americans. They were loyal colonists, same as anybody else, but they didn't want to break from England. And they were the huge majority. And so it was a very violent procedure, and a lot of these elements of that kind of violence get downplayed in one-volume biographies of the American Revolution. So if you know the subject, or if you're interested and you want to make sure you get that aspect, definitely put this book on your list. Then we have William Philpott. William Philpott is absolutely fantastic as a writer. This is his book on the First World War, War of Attrition. A meat grinder of a process, a meat grinder of a subject, and again, prone to a little bit of romanticization, but not in this book. Not in this book. So, although World War I has had a million books about it written, I think this will strike you as different from the others. I think it will stick out and be memorable. A little bit of fun here. Andrew McConnell Stott wrote a book called The Poet and the Vampire. Vampire is spelled that way very noticeably because this takes place on the shores of Lake Geneva. This is Byron and the Shelleys and Dr. John Polidori. This is the beginning of Frankenstein and Polidori's book, The Vampire, which is spelled that way. It's well documented, contradictorily documented, and everybody that was present wrote all the time. So we have a lot of documentation of this whole thing. It's an interesting incident in Mary Shelley's life. It's an interesting incident in Percy Bysshe Shelley's life. It's an interesting incident in Lord Byron's life. And it shows up differently in their different biographies. Here, there's a book just about that. And it's really diverting stuff. It really is. And then we'll, believe it or not, finish up a 2-hour video, my first 2-hour video, with John Marsloff's book about birds. We'll finish up on birds. This is his book, Suburbia. And as you can see from that wonderful cover, this is a study of birds that live with humans. They aren't seen by humans. You don't have to trek out and see them. They live with you. They live in your house. They live around your house. They live in your workplace. They live on your windowsills. They live, in my case, in the wainscoting of your house. And you know them every day. Whether you interact with them or not, they have completely acclimated themselves to living in human worlds. This is well illustrated. It's extremely engagingly written on that wonderful subject. I'm a little bit biased on this subject. I have a population of house sparrows that I have been feeding and observing and yelling at and getting to know for a long time, 15 years. I've known them through thick and thin, through horrifying winters when large numbers of them died. I've seen them fend off attempts to steal their territory. They have it really good. They have access to a porch where there's plenty of food, but they also have access to an insulated area that cannot be attacked by anything other than another bird. That's a really good habitat, much better than the sparrow habitats within a 100-mile radius of here. A lot of them. I've watched them in every weather, in every mood, through every generation. So I'm a little bit biased, but I find it hard to believe you won't find this fascinating. And the author is so engaging on the subject that, there's much like the squirrel book, there's no chance that you are a stranger to this subject. You live near birds. No matter what you are, no matter where you are, you live near birds. So this will connect with you. So anyway, there are 100 nonfiction recommendations for you in a 2-hour video. Very sorry for the length, but I wholeheartedly stand behind all of these books, and we'll have to do this again sometime. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.